All right, we're continuing with John 7 tonight, where Jesus teaches at the Feast of Tabernacles. As always, I like to go through and review a little bit of what we've done up to this point to kind of catch us up to where we are, so we can see how all this fits together and how it flows. And so, just considering the book of John and where we have gone and what has been taught. We know that John's gospel is very important to the whole understanding of who we are and coming into a full understanding of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. We understand that. And we know that he wrote to lead us as the readers to a settled faith, so we can come to a knowledge of who he has called us to be on the basis of the works of Jesus, because we see Jesus in full operation throughout this book. Some of the key themes that we have seen to develop in this book is the art or the idea of knowing God by believing. You will see as it is mentioned several times throughout this book, to those that believe, and it's always calling us up to a higher level of belief in Jesus Christ. But also we see and know that it's calling us to a higher level of life, a theme of life and a theme of bearing witness, or coming to an idea of being a witness to what Jesus Christ has done. But we also know that there's powerful revelation in this book. Some of the things I mentioned last time was Jesus challenged tradition in this book. You see that he comes on the scene bringing his new ideas and newness to the whole idea of what they had always done. So he challenged tradition, but also Jesus ushered in a certain level or era of change, if you will. But Jesus also pursued and defined purpose. We see that he did that. But also we see that Jesus tore down walls of division. We see that he did all these things as encapsulated in this very powerful book. But then also we see some very powerful moments as presented. And these are some of the highlights of what we have seen up to this point. We saw that Jesus turns water into wine, one of the miracles that he had done. But we also see that Jesus cleanses the temple. But not only that, we see that Jesus ministers to Nicodemus, and that was significant for that particular day. For Nicodemus was not considered one of the ones that he was supposed to minister to, but he was able to minister to the spirit and the man of Nicodemus. But also we see that Jesus has a very significant conversation with the Samaritan woman. We know that was something unusual for that time. Like I said, Jesus came to tear down walls of division, and he came to challenge tradition. So he should have never been having that conversation, but it was a very powerful conversation that he had with the Samaritan woman. But not only that, we see that Jesus heals the official's son, and he heals the man at the pool of Bethesda who had been there for 38 years, y'all. The man had been at the pool of Bethesda for 38 years, but he had an encounter with Jesus, and it changed his life. But how many of you know that could be us? We can have one encounter with Jesus that can change 38 years of despondency, 38 years of mess, 38 years of whatever. Just one encounter with Jesus. But not only that, we see that Jesus feeds the 5,000. Now, how many of you know that was a very significant moment in his ministry? He feeds the 5,000. But we also see that Jesus walks on water. Very significant. But then not only that gets us up to where we are at this point. In the last lesson, I believe we saw how Jesus says that I am the bread of life. Now, that in and of itself is powerful and significant, because that led us to the point where, if you remember, the people began to kind of doubt him at that point. They began to look like, well, wow, that's a very unusual teaching. Who can accept that? See, Jesus was, like I said, he came to challenge tradition. He came to break down walls of division, and he did it in a very, very unusual way. Which brings us up to now where we are in chapter number 7. Somebody say chapter 7. Somebody say chapter 7. See, we have the Feast of Tabernacles. That's a very significant, it sounds all fancy, but let's kind of see what that is. See, in the Feast of Tabernacle, it was one of 3 major feasts. You had the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacle, and you also had the Feast of Pentecost. 3 significant feasts that took place during this time. People from all over the Mediterranean region came to spend 8 days in Jerusalem. Somebody say 8 days. That's a long time to spend somewhere, but they came to do that. And I often wonder, now they were supposed to be doing, well, let me get to why they were doing it. It was a celebration of God's provision for Israel at the Exodus and in the wilderness. So it was a very significant time for them. But I always wonder, how many times do these significant moments that we have turn into tradition and they no longer mean what they used to mean? It makes me wonder, were they just coming out of tradition to spend the 8 days, or were their hearts really there? And we'll get to kind of what that means at the end as we finish the lesson tonight. But we also understand that during this time, people would camp out in temporary booths or tents with branches on the roofs. So they were gathering in a significant time to come to be a time of celebration for what God had done in their lives. You know, celebrating how God had provided for them, how God had made a way for them, and how God had brought them out of a tumultuous time. Which brings us to some thoughts that we have as it relates to chapter number 7. Let's look at our first point tonight. Our first point we want to discuss is people have various attitudes toward Jesus. We will see how that plays out in this particular book. Let's look at the first attitude that we see. The first attitude that we see towards Jesus, believe it or not, is an attitude of hostility. Let's look at it in chapter 7, verse number 1, as it says this. It says, "After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders were looking for a way to kill him or to murder him or to take him out." See, that's significant because we see that the people had developed sort of an attitude of hostility toward Jesus. You know, it was kind of significant because, see, he had performed all these miracles and done all these powerful things, but the people were in his presence, but they did not understand what his presence meant. So it caused them to develop somewhat of some hostile attitudes. But then that brings us to the next attitude that we see. The next attitude that we see towards Jesus are the mocking and unbelief of his brothers. Let's look at start with verse number 2, where it says this. "But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, 'Leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works you do.' See, no one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe in him. Therefore, Jesus told them, "My time is not yet near. For you, any time will do." And it says, "The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival. I am not going up to this festival because my time is not fully come." Verse 9, it says, "After he had said this, he stayed in Galilee. However," verse 10, it says, "after his brothers had left for the festival, he went out, not publicly, but in secret." Significant, y'all. We see an attitude of unbelief that has developed because of his brothers. So how many know we have an unbelief issue in the camp? See, unbelief will always cost you. Think about that for a moment. Unbelief will always cost you. It will cost you an experience. It will cost you an experience with Jesus, that is. It will cost you a new way of thinking. It will cost you going to another level. But see, how many know your family members? See, Jesus' brothers, those were his family members. Those were people who had become very familiar with him. See, familiarity can also lead to unbelief. Familiarity can lead to unbelief because they were in Jesus' presence, but they did not understand the significance of his presence. But see, unbelief can just cause anything to derail. So it's important to deal with the attitude of unbelief, because it said in verse number 5, when it was talking about his brothers, it says, for even his own brothers did not believe in him. That's significant, y'all, in it, because those were his brothers. Those were his people that were supposed to be sticking with him, but they did not believe in him. So some other attitudes that we see. That towards Jesus are acceptance, rejection, insult, and ignorance. See, they were all over the place in their thought life toward him. See, verse number 11, it says this. Now at the festival, the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, where is he? Verse 12, it says, among the crowd, there was widespread whispering about him. They were talking about him. Jesus was there to do a ministry and they was there to do a work, but how many of you know that the people had kind of gathered up to form their opinions about him? See, first we see an attitude of acceptance. It says in verse 12, the part of verse 12, it says this. Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, he is a good man. Others replied, no. They replied, no. But then verse 40, Elena, if you could skip down to verse 40, let me show you this real quick, and we'll come back up in a minute. It says, on hearing his words, see, this is another attitude that we see that's developed towards him right here. It says, on hearing these words, some of the people said, surely this man is a prophet. So this is another way that they're going back and forth. They're accepting him. He's a good man. Then some people say surely he's a prophet. Then verse 41, that says, some of them say, oh, he is the Messiah. So they were all over the place in their thoughts about, it's like they couldn't figure him out. They were in his presence, but they did not understand his significance. So we see that they had an attitude of acceptance. But not only that, we see an attitude of rejection. So we go from acceptance, but now we have rejection. Elena, if you could take me back to verse 12 for a minute, let me show you this. It says, others replied, no, he deceives the people. Verse 13, it says this, but no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders or the Jewish leaders. See, sometimes people are afraid to say things to your face. See, they wouldn't say it publicly because they were operating in fear themselves. I don't want to talk about him in front of everybody, so we'll just whisper about him and say, we don't want to say this in front of everybody, but Jesus, that man's crazy. He does these things, he does those things. Jesus is crazy. But then verse 41, it says, still others asked, how can the Messiah come from Galilee? See, because of their traditions, it was not possible for the Messiah to come from Galilee because tradition said that couldn't happen. Tradition had, no, there's no way that can go down. So what we'll do, we'll just continue to talk about him because Jesus is not who he says he is. Verse 42, it says this, does not Scripture say that the Messiah will come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived? So he can't come from Galilee. He's supposed to come from this place. He can't preach the gospel. He's from Griffin, Georgia. He's supposed to be from Jerusalem. He can't preach the gospel. He's from Dallas, Texas. He's supposed to be from New York. Come on. But then verse 43, it says this, thus the people were divided because of Jesus. Remember I told you Jesus came to tear down the walls of division. But how many of you know sometimes when you come to tear down division, sometimes it will cause division because people are stuck in their traditions. They're stuck in their way of thinking. We've never done it that way before. He's from Galilee. He can't be doing this stuff. Verse 44, it says this, some wanted to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him. See, some people want to take you out how they position themselves to speak against you or say things against you, but because God's hand is on you, they can't touch you. They can't take you out. So they were whispering about Jesus. They were saying things about him, but it did not keep him from achieving what he was supposed to be doing. So we saw attitudes of rejection. The people were saying things about him. But not only that, we see attitudes of insult and ignorance. See, verse 14, take me back to verse 14 for a minute. It says, not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. Verse 15, the Jews there were amazed and asked, how did this man get such learning without having been taught? See, Jesus answered, verse 16, my teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me. Verse 17, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. Whoever, verse 18, speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory. But he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about them. See, Jesus was dropping some bombs of knowledge on them. And see, he was well beyond their thinking and well beyond where they were. So he was challenging them. He was challenging them. So in verse 19, he says this, has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? See, he's asking them, why are you trying to kill me? Why are you trying to stop God from advancing his kingdom? Why are you putting these obstacles in front of me? Then verse 20, it says this, you are demon possessed. The crowd answered, who is trying to kill you? Can you believe they talked to Jesus like that, y'all? Can you believe it? They were, like I said, they were in his presence, but they did not understand his significance. So we had, how many know first we talked about an unbelief issue. Now we have a people issue. Oh, people. See, if people formed opinions about Jesus, people will form an opinion about you and me. But this is where we hang our hats. Don't allow the opinions of others to define you, and don't allow the opinions of others to distract you. I'll say that again. Don't allow the opinions of others to define you. Don't allow the opinions of others to distract you. Because when God has his hand on you, has his hand on what you're supposed to be doing, and you are truly understanding who you are supposed to be in him, nothing can hinder the plans and purposes God has established for your lives. So we have a people issue. But then another attitude that we see in the multitude is we see an attitude of what they say is openness as it relates to the temple guards. Now, how many know the temple guards were a very unusual group to be open, right? So verse 45, take me down there for a minute before we get to our next point. It says, finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, why didn't you bring him in? Then they said, verse 46, no one ever spoke the way this man does. The guards said. See, he got to them, but, they can't really admit it. But, no one ever spoke like this man spoke. Then they come back and they say to him, I love these conversations, y'all. See, the word will teach itself if you just look at it. It says, you mean he has deceived you also? The Pharisees retorted. See, one thing, let me pause there for a minute. One thing, I was talking to Crystal about this. I said, I never want to get so stuck in my thinking and what I think about things that I become a Pharisee. I never want to become a Pharisee because it's a thin line walking between what has always been, because they were just doing what they were supposed to do, what they felt like they were right. They weren't doing it with the intent to be evil. They just doing what they thought was right. But sometimes we have to always have our minds open to what God can do, because God, it says he's the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. But also we have to realize that we're in a different dispensation of who we are. So God's going to also speak to us during this dispensation as well. Not to destroy what we've always known, but to elevate our thinking. So They were sitting here amazed by what Jesus had said, but then the Pharisees were just doing what they always had done. They weren't open to something being different. Verse 49, it says, "No, but this mob that knows nothing of the law, there is a curse on them." Then Nicodemus, verse 50, Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who was one of their own number, asked this: "Does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he has been doing?" See, Nicodemus, remember, he had an encounter with Jesus, but now he's coming to them and he's telling them, "Come on, y'all, can we think a little bit differently about this? Can we think a little bit differently about this?" But guess what? They replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it and you will find out that a prophet does not come from Galilee." Guess what? They did all that and they still stuck in their traditional ways. But like I said, they weren't trying to be evil and do anything wrong. They were just doing what they had always done. How many know doing what you always had done doing what you've always done without being open to something new will keep you stuck? It will keep you stuck. So how many know we had a people issue? All those attitudes. Just think about it. Being Jesus during that day, you had an attitude of rejection. You had an attitude of openness. You had an attitude of those who wanted to kill him. Hey, that was a lot to deal with. Just all for pursuing his purpose, all those attitudes came against him. But then our second point we want to explore for a moment. There are key factors that affect our attitude towards Jesus, right? In verses 15, it says this: "The Jews there were amazed and asked, 'How did this man get such learning without having been taught?'" See, he was amazing them, y'all, by just being who he was, being different, challenging their traditions, challenging the systems of the day. And then verse 16, Jesus answered. See, I love the way Jesus talked to him. He said, "My teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me." Verse 17, "Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak my own truth." See, these are some things we want to think about. To recognize Jesus, we must adjust our expectations to God's plan and timing. See, we have our own way of things, the way we expect things to happen. We have our expectations of our relationship with God. So my question is, what are your expectations of Jesus? As you sit here today, as you sit in your life situations, your life circumstances, your life whatever, what are your expectations of Jesus? That's a question only we can answer in our own personal lives. But I had to challenge myself and ask myself that. Tyrus, what are your expectations of Jesus when things don't go your way, when things aren't going the way you wanted them to work out? What are your expectations of Jesus? And I've rested on the fact that I just expect him to be God in my life no matter what. That's my only expectation. Now that sounds cute to say, but you have to walk through that, right? Because we're all human and we have things that will pull on us, that will cause us to kind of, but that's part of the human experience, is knowing how to walk through stuff and knowing that God is right there walking through that stuff with you. Even when you're not your best self, he's walking right along through that with you. So to recognize Jesus, we must adjust our expectations to God's plan and timing. But then this right here, bless my socks off. It says, to recognize and honor Jesus, our love for him must become greater than our fear of others. Now that blessed me. Because fear is a powerful thing. Fear is shady, it's powerful, it's deceptive. It will have you thinking stuff that ain't true. But in order to recognize and honor Jesus, our love for him must become greater than our fear of others. See, verse 13, it says this. But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders or the Jews, right? They wouldn't say anything about him publicly because of fear. They wouldn't say anything about him publicly because of fear. How many times has fear prevented you from pursuing whatever? How many times has fear prevented you from being what you know you're supposed to be or doing what you're supposed to do? How many times has fear stopped you in your tracks? See, in order for us to recognize and honor Jesus, our love for him must become greater than our fear of others. We can't be afraid of what people are going to think about us. We can't be afraid of what people may say. Because Jesus was dealing with unbelief issue. He was dealing with attitudes. He was dealing with a people issue. But you can't let fear stop you. I know that's cute to say, but Jesus is there to walk through us with that. Because I've been afraid. I've had moments of fear. I've had moments of doubt. But Jesus has kept me and walked with me through those moments. So to know the truth about Jesus as well, we must choose doing God's will above everything else. Verse 17 again, it says, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. So we have to trust that what the Savior is doing is what's right. We have to trust that what God is doing or what Jesus is doing in our lives, even when we don't understand it, we have to trust that the will of God is what is needed and what is being accomplished in our lives. This brings us to our third point. We're almost there, y'all, to our third point. Jesus invites anyone who is thirsty to come to him and drink. Now, I had fun studying this part because this particular verse of scripture has been taught so many different ways, but God showed me it just brought new revelation to me. In verse 37, it says this: on the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, or in some translations it says he cried out, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. See, there's a significance found in this moment because understanding the Festival of Tabernacle and understanding what Jesus meant here is very significant. Because it says this about the Festival of Tabernacles. Every day during this Festival of Tabernacle, each day, during this Festival of Tabernacle, it was a joyous celebration was observed in which the priest brought water. Okay, and this water is very symbolic because it was symbolic of the water supplied from the rock in Exodus 17. If you remember that Moses struck a rock so that they could have water. So that was very significant there. So the priest brought water to the temple from the pool of Siloam in a golden pitcher. But during the procession, because they would process, the people recited Isaiah 12:3. See, the water was poured out on the altar as an offering to God, while the people shouted and sang. See, Jesus in this moment was becoming the fulfillment of all that ceremony had typified in the past. See, Jesus was coming in, telling them, let anyone, and this was bold for him to say this during this day because it broke because this was right in the middle, on the last day. He stood up and he cried out and said in the middle of their festival, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. See, you think about the significance of this moment. See, when you're thirsty, you normally feel a need to drink, or when you're thirsty, it's a strong desire for something. And sometimes in the context and way that the word thirsty is used, it could have a negative connotation. But in this instance, God showed me you had the word thirsty. Take me back to that verse one more time. Verse 37. You had the word thirsty juxtaposed with the word come. Thirsty, if you're thirsty, come. If you're thirsty, come. If you're thirsty, come. If you think about that moment, Jesus is telling them, because when you're thirsty, that means you're passionate. You're going to try to get to it no matter what. When you're thirsty, to be thirsty is to stay in the constant state of thirstiness is to remain unsatisfied. But that's why he tells them to come. Because if you come to me, you'll no longer be unsatisfied. Because if you stay in your thirst, it will constantly cause you to be unsatisfied. See, that's why you have to understand it's a cycle. It's not for when we first step on the scene to get saved. It ain't just that moment. It's every moment. When you have those moments when you feel like you just can't make it, you got to go back and remember verse 37. He told me if I'm thirsty, if I have these moments, I have to keep my desire for him in front of me. If I have these moments where I'm down, I have to keep my desire for Jesus at the forefront. If I have these moments where I'm experiencing trouble, I have to keep my desire for Jesus in the front. I have to keep Jesus at the forefront of everything because I can go to him. If you're thirsty, anyone who is thirsty, come to me and drink. So that water becomes significant, y'all. See, water is symbolic of life. Water is also symbolic of refreshment. Water also has the ability to purify. So if Jesus himself is standing there as the symbol of water, we can go to him and we will be renewed. We can go to him and we'll be refreshed. We can go to him and be purified. And we can go to him and our unsatisfaction will become satisfaction. Doesn't mean our circumstance will exactly change, but it means our mindset will become a mindset of satisfaction in the middle of whatever. So if you are anyone who is thirsty, come to me and drink. So I challenge you today, don't ever lose your thirst. Don't ever lose your thirst. And see, as we get ready to, let me show you this last point, and then I'm kind of going to wrap all this up. See, Jesus wants to give believers enough water to share with others. So what does that come into place? Remember in verse 37, he said, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. But then in verse 38, he says this, whoever believes in me, as scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. Then verse 39, it says, by this he meant the Spirit whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given since Jesus had not yet been glorified. See, that's significant for us today because we have to see ourselves when we are in a state of thirstiness. And when we go to Jesus, our unsatisfactions become satisfaction. So those who have been satisfied, that's us, the believers, you and I, we become channels of refreshment for other people. Think about it. Once we have experienced thirst and we go to him and we become satisfied vessels, that means we become channels, rivers of water flowing, of living water flowing to other people, which this thing becomes contagious at that point. We become refreshment to other people. The worst thing that we can be, what that tells me is that Christians, believers, we should always think about what we are presenting. We should always be presenting our best so that this thing can become contagious. We can win people just by being who God has called us to be. Because he said, whoever believes in me, that's us, we believe in him. The scriptures has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. So that means we become conduits for other people. I didn't think about it like that. Being thirsty is more than just coming to him in salvation, while that's a part of it. But being thirsty is also coming to him in a continuous cycle of everything that I'm going through. I can go to him. I can go to him. I don't have to stay in a constant state of thirst. I can go to him and become satisfied. So my question today as we get ready to close this, where are you today? Are you thirsty? Are you hungry for him? You can have thirst for him and not even realize it. But God has promised that if we release ourselves to him, he'll give us rest. And once he gives us rest, we can be renewed. We can be renewed in every situation. We can be renewed in our thinking. We can be renewed in our relationships. We can be renewed in our circumstances. See, we don't have to stay there. Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. There's no clarion call tonight for anything but this. Think about where you are in life. Think about where you are in your circumstances. Think about where you are in your relationships. Think about where you are just on every level. Jesus tells us, see, this whole thing about him, I believe this whole moment was about us learning that if we are thirsty, we can come to him. What does it mean to be thirsty? It means to have a strong desire for him. It means to have a compelling drawing towards him. And I know sometimes the vicissitudes of life can cause us to sometimes forget that. Things that we go through, things that we see, things that we have experienced can cause us to forget that. And just being familiar with things in life can cause us to forget that. But remember, we talked about how familiarity can lead to unbelief. Familiarity can lead us down a path of not really being thirsty. So Jesus commands us tonight, y'all. Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink.